August 25th, 1944. A dirt road 47 miles southeast of Paris. The dust cloud stretched for 3 miles behind the convoy, a brown curtain rising against the summer sky like smoke from some industrial furnace. Staff Sergeant Willie Johnson gripped the steering wheel of his GMC truck, sweat cutting channels through the grime on his face as he navigated another pothole that could swallow a jeep. In the passenger seat, Private Tommy Martinez counted mile markers, his voice barely audible over the engine roar. Mile 247, mile 248, mile 249. They had been driving for 16 hours straight, part of and moved like a mechanical river across endless procession of trucks that the French countryside. Behind them, 139 more vehicles followed in perfect formation, each one carrying the lifeblood of Allied victory. What Johnson and Martinez didn't know, what none of the 23,000 drivers racing across Europe that day could have imagined, was that they were participants in the most audacious logistical gamble in military history. A supply operation so massive, so unprecedented, that German intelligence initially refused to believe their own reconnaissance reports. The Third Reich's generals had spent months calculating American weaknesses, planning elaborate defensive strategies based on what they assumed would be inevitable supply shortages. They had studied maps, analysed distances, computed fuel consumption rates, and reached the same confident conclusion. The Americans would outrun their supply lines within weeks of the breakout from Normandy. Physics and mathematics guaranteed it. No army in history had ever sustained rapid advances across such distances without collapsing under the weight of its own logistical demands. The Germans were about to discover they had underestimated something far more dangerous than American tactics or technology. They had underestimated American audacity. The mathematics seemed ironclad. Every advancing army since Alexander the Great had faced the same brutal equation. The farther you advance, the longer your supply lines become. The longer your supply lines, the more resources required to maintain them. Eventually, every offensive reaches a point where more energy is spent moving supplies than fighting battles. Military historians had identified this breaking point with scientific precision. Based on historical precedent, the German General Staff calculated that American forces could advance approximately 200 miles beyond their established supply bases before logistical collapse became inevitable. General Omar Bradley's First Army had already advanced 250 miles from the Normandy beaches. General George Patton's Third Army was approaching 300 miles from their supply depots. By every conventional calculation, both armies should have ground to a halt weeks ago. Their tanks empty, their ammunition exhausted, their men hungry. Instead, they were accelerating. Patton's armoured spearheads were covering 40 miles per day, a pace that violated every principle of sustainable warfare. German reconnaissance pilots reported impossible scenes. American tank columns stretching beyond the horizon, their fuel trucks keeping pace, their ammunition carriers loaded with enough ordnance to level cities. Oberst Heinrich Weber, intelligence officer for Army Group B, submitted report after report that his superiors dismissed as fantasy. The Americans are moving faster than our calculations permit. Their supply columns are longer than our entire front. Their consumption rates exceed our production capacity even before the bombing campaign. Either our mathematics are wrong, or the Americans have discovered something we don't understand. Weber was right about one thing. The Americans had discovered something the Germans didn't understand. They had discovered what happens when industrial capacity meets logistical desperation and produces something entirely new. They called it the Red Ball Express, though the name wouldn't become official for another week. The operation that was rewriting the rules of warfare had begun as an emergency measure, a temporary solution to an impossible problem. Nobody expected it to work. Nobody predicted it would become the largest trucking operation in human history. The crisis had crystallized on August 12, 1944, when Lieutenant General Omar Bradley received a report that should have ended the Allied offensive. Fuel consumption was exceeding supply by 300,000 gallons daily. Ammunition expenditure was outpacing delivery by 2,000 tons per day. Food supplies were running 48 hours behind consumption. The mathematical projection was stark. Within 1 week, the entire Allied advance would halt, not due to German resistance, but due to empty gas tanks. General Bradley studied the logistics reports in his command trailer outside Coatenses. The numbers told a story of impending catastrophe. His armies were consuming 20,000 tons of supplies daily, while the established supply system could deliver only 14,000 tons. The shortfall was growing exponentially as the front lines moved farther from the beaches. Traditional military doctrine offered only one solution: halt the advance, establish forward supply bases, build permanent supply infrastructure, then resume operations in 6 to 8 weeks. The problem was that 6 to 8 weeks would give the Germans time to establish impregnable defensive positions along the German border. The window of opportunity created by the Normandy breakout would close forever. Bradley made a decision that military academies would study for decades. Instead of slowing the advance to match supply capacity, he would accelerate supply delivery to match the advance. Instead of building permanent supply infrastructure, he would create a mobile supply system that could move as fast as the combat units. Instead of following established logistics doctrine, he would invent new doctrine on the fly. The plan he outlined to his logistics staff sounded like strategic madness. Every available truck in the European theatre would be organised into continuous convoys running from supply depots to frontline units. The trucks would operate 24 hours daily, 7 days per week, with drivers working in shifts that pushed human endurance to its limits. Predetermined routes would be established and maintained exclusively for supply traffic. All other military traffic would be diverted to secondary roads. The operation would consume every gallon of fuel and every spare part in the supply system, betting everything on the assumption that rapid victory would make such consumption worthwhile. Colonel John Patterson, Bradley's chief logistics officer, calculated the requirements with growing amazement. The operation would require 6,000 trucks driving in continuous rotation. Each truck would need to complete the round trip from supply depot to frontline in less than 48 hours, including loading, unloading, and maintenance time. Drivers would work 20-hour shifts with only 4-hour rest periods. The fuel consumption of the supply trucks themselves would equal the fuel consumption of an entire armoured division. The plan violated every principle of sustainable logistics, but Bradley approved it anyway. The alternative was accepting strategic defeat at the moment of tactical victory. On August 25, 1944, the Red Ball Express began operations with 5,958 trucks, 23,000 drivers, and enough audacity to power a small war. The first convoys rolling out of the supply depots at Cherbourg and Utah Beach represented something unprecedented in military history. A supply system designed not for efficiency or sustainability, but for pure speed. The trucks themselves were marvels of American mass production. GMC 2.5-ton cargo trucks, built in Detroit factories that had converted from automobile production in a matter of months. Each truck could carry 5 tons of cargo at speeds up to 45 miles per hour on decent roads. With trailers attached, payload increased to 10 tons, though this reduced speed and increased fuel consumption. The drivers were an even more remarkable achievement. The majority were African American soldiers who had been assigned to service units due to military segregation policies. Many had been truck drivers in civilian life, operating delivery vehicles in Chicago, Detroit, New York, and dozens of smaller cities. Others had learned to drive in the army, mastering 10-ton vehicles in training programs that condensed months of instruction into weeks of intensive practice. Staff Sergeant Willie Johnson represented thousands of drivers whose civilian experience became military necessity. Before the war, he had driven delivery trucks for Montgomery Ward in Chicago. navigating traffic that prepared him perfectly for convoy operations. His co-driver, Private Tommy Martinez, had operated construction vehicles in Texas, experience that proved invaluable when navigating bomb-cratered roads. Together, they formed one crew in an operation that would employ more drivers than some entire divisions. The routes themselves were engineering marvels improvised under impossible conditions. Highway engineers surveyed roads that had been designed for civilian traffic and calculated maximum capacity for military convoys. Bridges were inspected and reinforced. Fuel stations were established at precisely calculated intervals. Maintenance facilities were positioned to service trucks without interrupting traffic flow. The entire system was designed with the precision of a Swiss watch and the redundancy of American industrial overkill. Route planning began with maps that showed distances German intelligence had calculated carefully. Cherbourg to the front lines near Chartres, 250 miles of roads that wound through Norman countryside, across rivers, through towns that had been battlefields weeks earlier. Under normal circumstances, such a journey would require careful planning, regular maintenance stops, and realistic expectations about travel time. The Red Ball Express operated under circumstances that were anything but normal. The convoys would travel at regulated speeds, maintaining precise intervals between vehicles to maximize road capacity while minimizing accidents. Lead vehicles would carry radios to report road conditions, traffic problems, and mechanical breakdowns. Recovery vehicles would follow each convoy to clear disabled trucks without stopping traffic flow. Military police would control intersections, ensuring that supply convoys received absolute priority over all other traffic. The system worked because it had to work, because the alternative was watching the greatest military opportunity of the war slip away due to empty fuel tanks and ammunition shortages. Because 23,000 drivers understood that their mission was as critical as any combat operation. They were about to prove that logistics could be as decisive as tactics, that supply lines could be as important as front lines, and that American industrial capacity could overcome any obstacle when properly organized and fearlessly employed. The Red Ball Express was rolling, and nothing would ever be the same. The German reaction to the first Red Ball Express convoys revealed the profound miscalculation at the heart of Nazi strategic thinking. Oberst Heinrich Weber's intelligence reports, initially dismissed as exaggerated, began arriving at Army Group B headquarters with increasing urgency. His reconnaissance pilots were documenting something that challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare itself. Flight report, August 27, 1944, Mann Klaus pilot Haupt Müller flying a Messerschmitt Bf 109 on reconnaissance over the Chartres-Orléans corridor, submitted observations that his superiors found difficult to accept. American supply columns extend unbroken for 65 kilometers. Vehicles spaced at 50-meter intervals, traveling at sustained speeds of 40 kilometers per hour. Estimated 2,000 trucks observed in single reconnaissance flight. Fuel consumption calculations suggest impossibility of sustained operations at observed scale. Müller's report was not unique. Luftwaffe pilots across the front were filing similar observations. American supply convoys that stretched beyond visual range, moving with mechanical precision that suggested unlimited resources. The mathematics troubled German analysts who had spent careers studying logistics. The Americans were operating supply lines that should have collapsed under their own weight weeks ago. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Eberbach, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, received intelligence briefings that contradicted everything he understood about mobile warfare. His staff officers presented calculations showing that American forces were consuming supplies faster than any army in history while maintaining advances that exceeded the operational tempo of German blitzkrieg campaigns. The implications were strategically terrifying. The Americans have created a supply system that operates beyond conventional limitations, Eberbach wrote in his daily situation report to Army Group B. Their truck convoys move with the regularity of railway schedules, but with the flexibility of tactical formations. Our interdiction efforts achieve minimal results because they possess redundancy beyond our capacity to disrupt. Every convoy we destroy is replaced by two more. Every bridge we demolish is bypassed within hours. German attempts to disrupt the Red Ball Express revealed the sophisticated planning behind what appeared to be simple trucking operations. Luftwaffe fighter bombers, operating with limited fuel and under constant threat from Allied air cover, managed occasional attacks on supply convoys. The results were instructive. Single truck losses had no measurable impact on overall supply flow. Convoy schedules adjusted automatically to account for delays. Alternative routes activated within hours of any disruption. Hauptmann Werner Schultz, commanding a company of Panzer IV tanks positioned near Melun, attempted to ambush a Red Bull convoy on August 29th. His after-action report, captured by American forces 3 days later, provided insight into German frustration with American logistics. We positioned 6 tanks in hull-down positions overlooking the main supply route. At 0630 hours, the lead elements of an American supply convoy appeared. We counted 47 trucks before opening fire. We destroyed 11 vehicles in the initial engagement. The convoy scattered, drivers abandoning trucks and seeking cover. We considered this a successful interdiction. Schultz's satisfaction was premature. Within 2 hours, American recovery vehicles arrived to clear the road. Within 4 hours, traffic resumed using an alternate route that his unit hadn't known existed. By evening, supply flow had returned to normal levels. The 11 destroyed trucks represented less than 0.2% of daily Red Bull operations. The Americans absorbed such losses without apparent concern, replacing destroyed vehicles from reserves that seemed inexhaustible. The psychological impact on German forces was profound. Soldiers accustomed to chronic supply shortages watched enemy convoys that wasted more fuel in spillage than German units received in monthly allocations. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, serving with the 2nd Panzer Division, wrote in a letter discovered after the war, "The Americans drive past our positions in endless columns. Their trucks are newer than our staff cars. Their drivers throw away cigarettes that would be treasures to us. They operate with casual abundance that makes our sacrifices seem pointless." German intelligence estimates of American supply capacity underwent constant revision upward. Initial calculations assumed the Red Ball Express represented a temporary surge that would exhaust American resources within weeks. By September, intelligence officers realized they were observing sustainable operations backed by industrial capacity beyond German comprehension. The Americans weren't gambling with their logistics. They were demonstrating superiority so overwhelming that gambling was unnecessary. The trucks themselves became symbols of American industrial might. German soldiers familiar with their own supply vehicles, aging Mercedes and Opel trucks maintained through constant improvisation, marveled at the uniformity and reliability of American equipment. Every Red Bull truck was identical, manufactured to specifications that ensured interchangeable parts and standardized maintenance procedures. Mechanics could repair any vehicle using components from any other vehicle. Drivers could operate any truck in the convoy without specialized training. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, captured during the fighting near Reims, described his interrogation by American intelligence officers. They asked about German supply operations, fuel availability, ammunition reserves. I answered truthfully because the situation was obvious. We were operating on empty, while they possessed unlimited resources. The interrogating officer showed me photographs of their supply depots. Mountains of equipment stretching beyond the horizon. Fuel storage tanks larger than our entire divisional supply capacity. The photographs Zimmermann described were not propaganda. They documented reality that exceeded German imagination. American supply depots established behind the advancing armies contained more equipment than many German divisions had seen in their entire operational piles measure history. Ammunition stocked in thousands of tons, fuel reserves calculated in millions of gallons, spare parts inventories that could rebuild entire armoured formations. The Red Ball Express drivers themselves became unwitting symbols of American abundance. German prisoners observed supply convoys and noted details that revealed the depth of American resources. The drivers wore new uniforms, operated well-maintained equipment, and consumed rations that exceeded German officer allocations. They appeared well-fed, adequately rested despite impossible schedules, and confident in ways that suggested unlimited backing. Staff Sergeant Willie Johnson's convoy, now veterans of 5 days' continuous operations, had developed efficiency that impressed even skeptical observers. Johnson and Martinez had refined their loading procedures, reducing turnaround time at hours to supply depots from 2:45 minutes. They had memorized every mile optimal speeds assigned route, identifying there for each section, predicting traffic conditions, dynating with other convoys to maximize through and output. The human cost of such operations was becoming apparent. Drivers working 20-hour shifts operated at the edge of human endurance. Accident rates increased as fatigue accumulated. Medical officers reported cases of exhaustion that required hospitalization. Yet the convoys continued rolling because the alternative was strategic defeat at the moment of tactical victory. German forces, attempting to exploit these human limitations, discovered that American logistics included redundancy for everything, including personnel. Tired drivers were rotated to rest positions, while fresh crews took over their vehicles. Medical facilities along the supply routes treated exhausted personnel and returned them to duty when recovered. The supply system maintained operational tempo despite individual human limitations. The mathematics of the Red Ball Express defied conventional military analysis. German intelligence officers calculated fuel consumption rates that should have exhausted American reserves within days. They documented ammunition expenditure that exceeded German monthly production in single battles. They observed equipment replacement rates that suggested manufacturing capacity beyond rational limits. What they failed to understand was that they were witnessing the application of American industrial capacity to military operations. The same factories that had produced 300,000 aircraft during the war were supporting supply operations with spare parts, replacement vehicles, and maintenance equipment. The same agricultural system that fed 130 million Americans was providing rations for millions of soldiers thousands of miles from home. The same transportation network that moved civilian commerce across a continent was adapted to move military supplies across an ocean and halfway across Europe. The Red Ball Express represented more than logistical innovation. It demonstrated the fundamental difference between economies designed for conquest and economies designed for production. German industry, optimized for military efficiency and resource extraction from conquered territories, could not compete with American industry, optimized for abundance and growth. The comparison revealed itself in every aspect of the supply competition. By early September, German resistance was crumbling, not due to tactical defeats, but due to logistical exhaustion. Units reported ammunition shortages that prevented effective counterattacks, fuel shortages that immobilized armored formations, food shortages that weakened soldiers already stressed by constant combat. Meanwhile, American forces advanced with supplies that seemed unlimited, equipment that appeared inexhaustible, and confidence that reflected material superiority. The Red Ball Express had achieved something unprecedented in military history. It had created a supply system that moved faster than combat operations, supported advances that exceeded historical precedent, and demonstrated industrial capacity that redefined strategic possibility. The Germans had laughed at American supply lines, confident that distance and mathematics would achieve what their armies could not. They were about to discover that American audacity backed by unlimited resources, could overcome any obstacle that conventional thinking considered insurmountable. The statistics emerging from Red Bull Express operations in early September painted a picture that challenged everything military theorists understood about supply warfare. Daily tonnage figures, recorded by Transportation Corps officers, revealed an operation that had evolved beyond its original emergency mandate into something approaching logistical perfection. On September 7, 1944, Red Bull convoys delivered 12,342 tons of supplies to frontline units, exceeding the daily consumption of 3 full armoured divisions while maintaining operational tempo that allowed no rest periods. The human drama unfolding on French highways involved more than statistics. It encompassed individual stories of endurance that redefined what soldiers could accomplish when national survival demanded impossible performance. Technical Sergeant Robert Washington, driving convoy position number 247, had completed 23 round trips between Cherbourg and the front lines in 18 days. His logbook, maintained with military precision despite exhaustion that made his hands shake, recorded mileage figures that totaled more than the distance from New York to Los Angeles. Washington's co-driver, Private First Class James Rivera, calculated fuel consumption during their rest periods with obsessive attention to detail that revealed the scope of their mission. "We burned 847 gallons yesterday alone," Rivera wrote in a letter to his wife in San Antonio. "That's enough gasoline to drive a civilian car from Texas to California twice, and we're just one truck in thousands. The Germans must think we've discovered oil wells in France." The German High Command was indeed grappling with intelligence reports that suggested American supply capacity approached the supernatural. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Armoured Troops, received briefings that contradicted 4 years of successful blitzkrieg operations. His staff officers presented calculations showing American supply consumption rates that exceeded German production capacity even during peacetime industrial peaks. The implications threatened fundamental assumptions about resource warfare, these brief. Guderian's response toings revealed growing German desperation. "If these reports are accurate, we are not fighting an army, but an industrial empire. Their supply system operates with redundancy that makes interdiction meaningless. We destroy one convoy and 2 more appear. We crater a road and they build 3 alternate routes. Our entire strategy of defeating them through attrition has been rendered obsolete by their capacity to sustain losses indefinitely." The roads themselves were becoming monuments to American engineering improvisation. Highway maintenance crews, working around the clock to support Red Bull operations, had transformed French country roads into military highways, capable of supporting continuous heavy traffic. Bridge reinforcement projects completed in days normally required months of planning and construction. Road widening operations carved new lanes through fields and forests with bulldozers that operated by floodlight during nighttime hours. Captain Ernest Thompson, commanding the 3,947th Engineer Construction Company, supervised road improvements that impressed even veteran construction workers. His crews had widened 47 miles of highway between Avranches and Chartres, adding shoulders capable of supporting disabled vehicles without blocking traffic flow. They had reinforced 23 bridges to handle loaded convoy weights that exceeded original design specifications by 300%. They had established fuel stops, maintenance facilities, and communication centres at precisely calculated intervals. The fuel stops represented logistical achievements that German intelligence found incomprehensible. Each facility could refuel 200 trucks per hour using pumping systems that operated faster than civilian gas stations. Storage tanks contained reserves sufficient to fuel entire armoured divisions. Pump attendants, many of them soldiers who had worked at gas stations in civilian life, serviced convoys with efficiency that minimised delays while maximising throughput. Private Danny Sullivan, operating fuel pumps at mile marker 127, had developed techniques that reduced refueling time per truck from 8 minutes to 4 minutes without compromising safety procedures. His innovations, copied by pump operators throughout the Red Bull system, contributed to overall efficiency gains that allowed convoys to maintain schedule despite increasing traffic volume. Sullivan's civilian experience operating gas stations in Detroit provided expertise that military training could not duplicate. The maintenance facilities established along Red Bull routes represented another dimension of American logistical superiority. Mobile repair shops, equipped with spare parts inventories that could rebuild entire vehicles, operated 24 hours daily to keep convoys moving. Master Sergeant William Parker, supervising maintenance operations at the Chartres depot, commanded resources that exceeded many German divisional repair facilities. Parker's inventory included 2,847 different spare parts, maintained in quantities calculated to support projected breakdown rates across the entire Red Bull fleet. Engine blocks, transmission assemblies, drive shafts, brake systems, electrical components, and hundreds of smaller parts were stockpiled in quantities that ensured no truck remained disabled for more than 6 hours. The redundancy reflected American manufacturing capacity that produced spare parts faster than equipment could wear out. German attempts to analyze American maintenance operations revealed industrial capabilities that defied European understanding. Captured maintenance manuals described repair procedures standardized across thousands of identical vehicles. Parts catalogs listed components manufactured in dozens of different factories, but engineered to identical specifications. Maintenance schedules outlined preventive procedures designed to maximize vehicle reliability while minimizing repair time. Oberst Werner Schulze, German transportation officer captured during the retreat from the Seine, underwent interrogation that revealed American logistical superiority from an enemy perspective. The interrogating officers showed him photographs of Red Bull maintenance facilities, asking him to estimate German capacity to establish comparable operations. Schulze's response, recorded in intelligence files, captured German recognition of American supremacy. Such facilities would require the entire German automotive industry working exclusively for military purposes, Schulze admitted. The spare parts inventory in single American depot exceeds our national production capacity for most components. They operate with abundance that makes our resource calculations meaningless. We planned for war of attrition against enemies with limited resources. We discovered we were fighting enemies with unlimited resources. The psychological warfare aspect of Red Bull operations extended beyond German military personnel to French civilian populations witnessing American logistical power. Villages along convoy routes observed supply columns that demonstrated Allied commitment to victory through sheer material superiority. The sight of endless truck convoys, operating with mechanical precision day and night, provided reassurance that liberation was backed by resources sufficient to guarantee success. Marie Dubois, mayor of the village of Nogent-le-Rotrou, positioned along a major Red Bull route, described the impact on local morale in her wartime diary. The American trucks pass our village continuously, loaded with supplies that represent hope for our future. The drivers wave at our children, share their rations with hungry families, and demonstrate through their presence that powerful allies support our liberation. The abundance of their supplies proves they possess resources to complete what they have begun. The economic implications of Red Bull operations were beginning to reshape Allied strategic planning. Quartermaster General Edmund Gregory calculated that supply operations were consuming resources equivalent to the gross domestic product of medium-sized nations. Fuel consumption alone exceeded the annual gasoline production of most European countries. The financial cost approached the budgets of entire government departments during peacetime. Yet the investment was producing strategic returns that justified any expenditure. American armies were advancing faster than any military force in history, while maintaining supply lines that supported offensive operations across unprecedented distances. The traditional relationship between logistics and tactics had been reversed. Instead of tactics being constrained by logistical limitations, logistics were enabling tactical possibilities that exceeded historical precedent. General Bradley's headquarters received daily reports that documented the strategic impact of logistical innovation. Third Army units had advanced 387 miles from their original positions, capturing territory equivalent to several small nations while maintaining combat effectiveness that allowed continued offensive operations. First Army formations had penetrated German defensive positions that conventional wisdom considered impregnable, supported by ammunition supplies that enabled sustained artillery bombardments impossible under normal logistical constraints. The ripple effects extended throughout the Allied command structure. Air Force operations increased dramatically when forces could ground advance rapidly enough to capture airfields that brought to targets within fighter range. Naval operations benefited when coastal ports were captured quickly enough to establish new supply bases. Intelligence operations improved when rapid advances disrupted German communications faster than they could establish new networks. By mid-September, Red Ball Express operations had evolved into something resembling a military-industrial ecosystem. The original emergency measure had become a permanent capability that redefined what armies could accomplish when supported by unlimited resources and innovative organization. The system that began as desperate improvisation had become the foundation for strategic transformation. The German response revealed the psychological impact of facing an enemy with apparently unlimited resources. Intelligence reports documented declining morale among German units that witnessed American supply operations firsthand. Soldiers accustomed to chronic shortages watched enemy forces waste more supplies in routine operations than German armies received for major offensives. Feldwebel Hans Richter, captured during the fighting near Metz, described the demoralization effect during post-war interviews. "We knew we were defeated when we saw their waste. American soldiers threw away equipment we would treasure. Their supply trucks spilled more fuel than our tanks carried. They operated with casual abundance that made our sacrifices seem pointless." How do you fight enemies who possess everything in unlimited quantities? The Red Ball Express had achieved something beyond logistical success. It had created psychological warfare through demonstration of industrial superiority. The sight of endless supply convoys operating with mechanical precision and apparent immunity to interdiction convinced German forces that resistance was futile against enemies possessing unlimited resources. American commanders were beginning to understand that they had discovered something revolutionary. The Red Ball Express represented more than innovative logistics. It demonstrated that industrial capacity, properly organized and fearlessly employed, could overcome any obstacle that conventional military thinking considered insurmountable. The system that had begun as emergency improvisation was becoming the template for future warfare. The trucks continued rolling eastward, carrying with them the tools of inevitable victory and the evidence of American determination to achieve strategic objectives regardless of conventional limitations. The Red Ball Express had become unstoppable not because of superior tactics or better equipment, but because it represented the application of unlimited resources to achieve unlimited objectives. The Germans had underestimated American audacity, and that miscalculation was reshaping the strategic balance of the entire war. The mathematics of momentum were rewriting themselves on French highways. By September 15th, Red Ball Express operations had achieved something that military theorists would spend decades trying to understand. The supply system, designed as a temporary emergency measure, had evolved into a perpetual motion machine of warfare, consuming resources at rates that exceeded German comprehension, while enabling advances that redefined strategic possibility. Colonel Raymond Morrison, Chief of Transportation for the First Army, received reports that morning that captured the scope of what they had accomplished. In 21 days of continuous operations, Red Bull convoys had delivered 347,000 tons of supplies across distances that should have made such deliveries impossible. The tonnage exceeded the cargo capacity of major seaports during peacetime operations. Individual drivers had logged mileage equivalent to transcontinental journeys, while maintaining schedules that commercial trucking companies would have considered fantasy. The human cost was becoming measurable in ways that statistics couldn't capture. Technical Sergeant Marcus Johnson, no relation to Willie Johnson, but sharing the burden of impossible driving schedules, had been for 27 consecutive days, with only brief rest periods between runs. His hands had developed permanent tremors from gripping steering wheels for 20-hour stretches. His eyes required constant moisture drops to combat dust and exhaustion. His logbook entries, written in increasingly shaky handwriting, documented a descent into mechanical routine that bordered on hallucination. Johnson's experience was replicated across thousands of drivers who had pushed human endurance beyond previously known limits. Medical officers established aid stations along convoy routes specifically to treat exhaustion cases that didn't qualify for evacuation but required intervention to maintain operational effectiveness. Stimulant medications, distributed under medical supervision, kept drivers alert during critical phases of their runs. Salt tablets and vitamin supplements countered the effects of dehydration and malnutrition that resulted from eating rations while driving. The German intelligence apparatus was struggling to comprehend observations that contradicted fundamental assumptions about human limitations. Oberst Klaus Dietrich, commanding reconnaissance units tasked with monitoring American supply operations, submitted reports that his superiors found increasingly difficult to accept. Enemy drivers operate continuously without apparent rest periods. Vehicle maintenance occurs without interrupting traffic flow. Supply volumes increase daily despite mathematical impossibility of sustained operations at observed scales. Dietrich's reconnaissance teams, operating behind American lines with increasing difficulty as Allied air superiority made movement nearly impossible, documented supply operations that challenged basic military doctrine. American convoys maintained formation discipline despite driver fatigue that should have caused massive accidents. Maintenance schedules continued without reducing operational tempo. Fuel consumption supported advancing armies while simultaneously supporting the supply system itself, creating a closed loop of logistics that seemed to generate its own momentum. The psychological impact on German forces was approaching complete demoralization. Hauptmann Wilhelm Fischer, commanding a company of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, wrote in his final report before his unit's destruction near Nancy, "American supply columns pass our concealed positions continuously. We count vehicles until the numbers become meaningless. Their abundance makes our resistance seem theatrical, a performance without purpose. How do you fight enemies who possess infinite resources?" Fischer's question reflected growing German recognition that they were facing something unprecedented in military history. The Red Bull Express had transcended logistical innovation to become strategic transformation. The system enabled American forces to operate beyond conventional constraints, while German forces operated within limitations that grew more restrictive daily. The comparison revealed itself in every engagement, every tactical situation, every strategic decision. American ammunition expenditure during the Siege of Metz illustrated the practical implications of unlimited supply. Artillery units fired preparation barrages that consumed more shells in single days than German armies received in monthly allocations. The psychological effect on defending forces was devastating. German soldiers, accustomed to rationing every round, faced enemies who could maintain continuous bombardment for days without apparent concern for ammunition conservation. Lieutenant Colonel William Hayes, commanding the 95th Field Artillery Battalion, supervised bombardments that redefined the relationship between firepower and tactics. His guns fired 14,000 rounds during a 72-hour period, creating destruction that eliminated German defensive positions through sheer volume rather than precision targeting. The ammunition arrived continuously via Red Bull convoys that maintained delivery schedules despite German interdiction attempts. Hayes' after-action reports documented the strategic advantage of unlimited ammunition supply. Previous operations required careful target selection and ammunition rationing that limited effectiveness. Current operations allowed sustained fire that eliminated entire defensive complexes without concern for supply constraints. The psychological impact on German forces equaled the physical destruction. Enemy soldiers surrender bombard, then ended bombardments they knew would continue indefinitely. The fuel situation provided another dimension of American logistical superiority that German forces found incomprehensible. Patton's Third Army was consuming 400,000 gallons of gasoline daily while maintaining advances that covered 40 miles per day across terrain that German engineers had considered impassable for mechanized forces. The fuel arrived via Red Bull convoys that operated their own consumption calculations based on unlimited availability rather than conservation requirements. Major General John Wood, commanding the 4th Armored Division, received fuel allocations that exceeded peacetime consumption by entire civilian populations. His tanks operated without range limitations that had constrained previous operations. Reconnaissance units conducted extended patrols without fuel considerations. Maintenance vehicles operated continuously without rationing requirements. The abundance enabled tactical flexibility that multiplied combat effectiveness beyond simple numerical comparisons. German forces, attempting to match American operational tempo, discovered that fuel shortages made sustained operations impossible. Oberst Heinrich Müller, commanding the 11th Panzer Division, reported fuel allocations that required choosing between tactical movement and basic maintenance operations. His units could either fight or maneuver, but lacked resources to do both simultaneously. The constraint forced tactical decisions based on resource availability rather than military effectiveness. The contrast became most apparent during mobile engagements, where American forces could maintain contact indefinitely, while German forces had to disengage due to fuel limitations. Tank battles that should have been decided by equipment quality or crew training instead were determined by which side could sustain operations longest. American units invariably prevailed, not through superior tactics, but through superior endurance enabled by unlimited supply. Food supplies represented yet another dimension of American abundance that affected morale beyond simple nutrition. Red Bull convoys delivered rations that exceeded German civilian allocations, while German military units subsisted on reduced portions that barely maintained combat effectiveness. The psychological impact extended beyond hunger to encompass recognition that American soldiers were better fed than German civilians. Sergeant First Class Robert Martinez, Willie Johnson's former co-driver, now commanding his own truck, observed German prisoners during loading operations at forward supply points. They stared at our rations like they'd never seen real food before. Canned meat, white bread, coffee, cigarettes, candy bars, stuff we took for granted was luxury to them. Made you realize we weren't just fighting their army, we were fighting their whole economy. Martinez's observation captured the strategic dimension of logistical warfare. The Red Bull Express demonstrated American capacity to maintain military forces at higher living standards than German civilians enjoyed during wartime. The comparison revealed fundamental differences between economies designed for conquest and economies designed for abundance. American soldiers fought knowing their families lived better than enemy soldiers, while German soldiers fought knowing their families lived worse than enemy prisoners. Medical supplies provided another measure of American logistical superiority that affected combat effectiveness in measurable ways. Red Bull convoys delivered pharmaceutical supplies that enabled American forces to maintain health standards impossible under normal field conditions. Penicillin, sulfur drugs, morphine, and surgical supplies arrived in quantities that eliminated medical limitations on combat operations. Captain Robert Sherman, Chief Medical Officer for the 90th Infantry Division, supervised medical operations that rivaled civilian hospital capabilities. His aid stations possessed pharmaceutical supplies exceeding many German military hospitals. Surgical facilities could perform procedures that German field medicine considered impossible due to resource constraints. Evacuation procedures moved wounded soldiers to advanced treatment facilities faster than German forces could move their wounded to basic aid stations. The medical advantage translated directly into combat effectiveness. American units maintained strength levels that German units couldn't match due to medical evacuation and treatment capabilities. Soldiers returned to duty after wounds that would have permanently disabled German personnel. Disease rates remained low, despite field conditions that historically caused massive medical casualties. The health advantage multiplied combat power beyond simple numerical calculations. German medical officers, when captured, provided intelligence that revealed the scope of American medical superiority. Oberarzt Friedrich Weber, Chief Medical Officer for the 352nd Infantry Division, described American medical capabilities during interrogation. Their field hospitals possess equipment we lack in major civilian facilities. Their pharmaceutical supplies exceed our national production. Their evacuation system moves wounded faster than our communications move messages. They maintain military effectiveness through medical superiority we cannot match. Weber's assessment reflected growing German recognition that American logistical advantages extended beyond simple supply delivery to encompass every aspect of military operations. The Red Bull Express enabled comprehensive support that maintained American forces at peak effectiveness, while German forces deteriorated under the accumulated stress of chronic shortages. Communication equipment delivered via Red Bull convoys provided yet another force multiplier that enhanced American tactical capabilities. Radio sets, telephone equipment, signal cables, and electronic components arrived in quantities that enabled communication networks exceeding peacetime civilian systems. The communications advantage allowed coordination between units separated by distances that would have made German operations impossible. Colonel James Patterson, signal officer for the 12th Army Group, supervised communications installations that connected American forces across hundreds of miles with clarity that exceeded commercial telephone systems. His equipment inventories included backup systems for backup systems, ensuring communication reliability that German forces couldn't achieve even under ideal conditions. The redundancy reflected manufacturing capacity that produced more communication equipment than could be destroyed by enemy action. The communication superiority that multiplied tactical coordination increased combat effectiveness exponentially. American units operated with situational awareness that German commanders envied. Artillery fire could be coordinated across division boundaries. Air support could be requested and delivered within minutes. Intelligence could be shared instantaneously across the entire front. The communication advantage transformed individual units into components of a unified war machine. German forces operating with communication equipment that frequently failed due to age and inadequate maintenance could not achieve comparable coordination. Units operated in isolation, unaware of situations beyond visual range. Artillery support required time-consuming procedures that often resulted in targets disappearing before fire missions could be completed. Air support remained theoretical for most ground units. The communication disadvantage fragmented German forces into isolated components that could be defeated individually. The Red Bull Express had achieved something beyond logistical success. It had created a comprehensive support system that maintained American forces at peak effectiveness across every measurable parameter. The trucks rolling eastward carried more than supplies. They carried the tools of systematic superiority that made German resistance increasingly futile with each passing day. The momentum was becoming self-sustaining, generating its own energy through the application of unlimited resources to unlimited objectives. The system that had begun as emergency improvisation was becoming the foundation for a new kind of warfare where industrial capacity determined strategic outcomes more decisively than traditional military factors. The ripple effects of Red Ball Express operations were transforming the fundamental nature of warfare itself. By late September 1944, what had begun as an emergency trucking operation had evolved into something approaching industrial warfare on a scale never before witnessed. The supply convoys rolling across France represented more than logistical innovation. They embodied the complete mobilization of American industrial capacity applied to military objectives with ruthless efficiency. Staff Sergeant Willie Johnson, now a veteran of 34 consecutive days behind the wheel, had become something approaching a machine himself. His body had adapted to the rhythm of endless highways, his hands moving automatically through gear changes, while his mind calculated distances, fuel consumption, and arrival times with mechanical precision. The man who had driven delivery trucks through Chicago traffic now commanded a rolling segment of the most sophisticated supply operation in military history. Johnson's truck GMC serial number 847291 had logged 18,247 miles since Red Ball operations began. The odometer reading exceeded the distance from New York to Tokyo, all of it covered on French roads that ranged from adequate highways to crater-pocked trails that barely deserved the name. The vehicle itself had become a testament to American manufacturing quality. Despite abuse that would have destroyed civilian trucks within weeks, it continued operating with only routine maintenance performed during brief loading stops. The maintenance records attached to Johnson's truck told a story that German intelligence officers found increasingly difficult to believe. 17 oil changes performed without interrupting convoy schedules. 43 tire replacements completed while the vehicle remained loaded with cargo. 6 brake system overhauls accomplished during scheduled fuel stops. The service history represented more maintenance activity than most German vehicles received during their entire operational lifespan. Private Tommy Martinez, promoted to sergeant during the operation without ceremony or interruption to his driving duties, had developed expertise that transformed him from passenger to co-commander of their mobile logistics unit. His ability to read maps while calculating fuel consumption, predict traffic conditions, and coordinate with other convoy elements had evolved into something approaching tactical brilliance. The farm boy from Texas had become a master of mechanized warfare through necessity and repetition. Martinez's navigation skills had been honed by covering the same routes repeatedly until every mile marker, every intersection, every potential bottleneck was memorized with photographic precision. He could predict travel times within minutes across distances exceeding 200 miles. He knew which bridges could support loaded convoys, which hills required downshifting, which fuel stops operated most efficiently. His knowledge had become institutional memory that the Red Ball Express relied upon for continued success. The German High Command was receiving intelligence reports that described American supply operations in terms that approached the supernatural. General Oberst Alfrey of Operations D. Jodl, chief for the Wehrmacht, reviewed briefings that challenged every assumption about resource warfare. American supply consumption exceeded German industrial production by factors that made mathematical comparison meaningless. Individual American divisions consumed more fuel than entire German army groups received in monthly allocations. Jodl's staff officers presented calculations that revealed the scope of American logistical superiority with stark clarity. The Red Ball Express was delivering supplies at rates that exceeded the cargo capacity of major seaports during peacetime operations. The fuel consumption of the supply trucks themselves equaled the fuel allocation for 3 German armored divisions. The spare parts inventory for a single American supply depot exceeded German national production capacity for most components. The psychological impact on German decision-making was becoming measurable. Strategic planning sessions increasingly focused on resource limitations rather than tactical possibilities. Operations were designed around what German forces lacked rather than what they could accomplish. The constraint mentality was producing defensive thinking that abandoned the aggressive initiative that had characterized German military doctrine since the beginning of the war. Oberst Friedrich von Mellenthin, operations officer for Army Group G, documented this transformation in reports that would later provide historians with insight into German strategic paralysis. American abundance has created tactical options we cannot counter because we lack resources to implement comparable measures. They advance rapidly because unlimited fuel enables continuous movement. They maintain pressure because unlimited ammunition enables sustained bombardment. They replace losses because unlimited production enables immediate reinforcement. Von Mellenthin's analysis captured the essence of what the Red Ball Express had accomplished beyond simple supply delivery. It had created tactical flexibility that multiplied combat effectiveness exponentially. American commanders could choose tactics based on military effectiveness rather than resource availability. German commanders were forced to choose tactics based on resource availability rather than military effectiveness. The constraint difference was determining strategic outcomes more decisively than traditional military factors. The roads themselves had been transformed into something approaching military infrastructure of unprecedented sophistication. Engineering units working alongside Red Ball operations had created highway systems that exceeded civilian interstate projects in scope and complexity. Mile after mile of reinforced roadway, designed to support continuous heavy traffic, stretched across France like arteries feeding the advance of mechanized armies. Captain Ernest Thompson's engineering crews had completed road improvements that would have required years during peacetime construction projects. His units had widened highways, reinforced bridges, established fuel facilities, created maintenance areas, and installed communication systems across hundreds of miles of French countryside. The infrastructure projects were completed while maintaining traffic flow that never interrupted supply operations. Thompson's construction statistics documented achievements that civilian contractors would have considered impossible. His crews had moved 847,000 cubic yards of earth to create road improvements. They had poured 12,000 cubic yards of concrete for bridge reinforcements. They had installed 247 miles of communication cable to connect supply facilities. They had established 43 fuel depots, with storage capacity exceeding major civilian gas stations. The work was completed by units that had learned construction techniques through military necessity rather than formal training. The fuel distribution system alone represented logistical achievement that redefined what was possible under field conditions. Storage facilities established at precise intervals along convoy routes contained reserves calculated to support projected traffic without interruption for maintenance or resupply. Pumping systems operated faster than commercial facilities while maintaining safety standards that prevented accidents despite continuous operations under combat conditions. Master Sergeant William Parker's maintenance facilities had evolved into something approaching mobile factories capable of rebuilding vehicles while maintaining production schedules that exceeded peacetime manufacturing. His crews could completely overhaul truck engines in 4 hours, replace transmission systems in 3 hours, and rebuild brake systems in 2 hours. The repair capabilities enabled Red Ball operations to maintain fleet readiness, despite wear rates that should have disabled vehicles within weeks. Parker's spare parts inventory had grown to encompass components for every conceivable repair requirement, engine blocks stockpiled in quantities sufficient to rebuild entire motor pools, transmission assemblies maintained in reserve levels that exceeded many German divisional equipment allocations. Brake components, electrical systems, cooling systems, and hundreds of smaller parts were available in quantities calculated to prevent any vehicle from remaining disabled for extended periods. The redundancy reflected American manufacturing capacity that produced spare parts faster than equipment could wear out under normal circumstances. The Red Ball Express was operating under circumstances that exceeded normal by factors that made wear calculations meaningless. Yet the supply of replacement components continued without interruption, demonstrating industrial depth that German planners had never imagined possible. German attempts to analyze American maintenance operations revealed manufacturing capabilities that defied European industrial experience, captured maintenance manuals, described repair runs, procedures standardized across production that numbered in tens of thousands of identical vehicles. Parts catalogues listed components manufactured simultaneously in dozens of factories, but engineered to specifications so precise that interchangeability was guaranteed regardless of manufacturing location. The standardization enabled maintenance efficiency that multiplied operational effectiveness beyond simple numerical calculations. Any mechanic could repair any vehicle using parts from any supply source. Training requirements were minimized because procedures remained identical across the entire fleet. Repair times were reduced because diagnostic procedures eliminated guesswork. The systematic approach to maintenance reflected manufacturing philosophy that prioritized operational efficiency over production cost. German maintenance operations, dependent on aging equipment maintained through improvisation and adaptation, could not achieve comparable efficiency. Vehicles required specialized parts that were often unavailable. Repair procedures varied between different models and manufacturers. Mechanics required extensive training to service different types of equipment. The maintenance burden consumed resources that American forces allocated to offensive operations. The communication networks established to coordinate Red Ball operations had evolved into information systems that provided situational awareness, exceeding civilian commercial networks. Radio systems connected convoy elements across distances that spanned multiple time zones. Telephone networks linked supply facilities with command centers through circuits that maintained clarity despite interference from combat operations. Message traffic moved faster than German strategic communications. Colonel James Patterson's signal installations processed information volumes that exceeded major civilian telephone exchanges during peak hours. His communication centers coordinated convoy movements, maintenance schedules, fuel deliveries, and emergency responses across hundreds of simultaneous operations. The information processing capabilities enabled management efficiency that transformed logistics from reactive problem solving to predictive resource allocation. The intelligence gathered through communication monitoring provided American commanders with real-time awareness of German capabilities that exceeded German commanders' knowledge of their own forces. Convoy drivers reported German troop movements observed during supply runs. Maintenance facilities intercepted German radio transmissions that revealed fuel shortages and equipment failures. Supply depot personnel documented German air activity that indicated operational limitations. The intelligence advantage multiplied tactical effectiveness by enabling American forces to exploit German weaknesses faster than German forces could identify American vulnerabilities. Attacks could be launched against German units before they completed defensive preparations. Supply shortages could be exploited before German commanders realized they existed. Retreat routes could be interdicted before German forces began withdrawing. German intelligence operations, constrained by communication equipment that frequently failed and information processing that relied on manual methods, could not achieve comparable awareness. German commanders operated with situational knowledge that was hours or days behind actual conditions. Tactical decisions were based on assumptions rather than current intelligence. Strategic planning proceeded without accurate knowledge of enemy capabilities or intentions. The medical support delivered via Red Bull convoys had created healthcare systems that maintained American forces at health standards exceeding civilian populations during peacetime. Field hospitals possessed pharmaceutical supplies that eliminated disease as a limiting factor in combat operations. Surgical capabilities enabled treatment of wounds that would have been fatal under normal field conditions. Evacuation procedures moved casualties from battlefield to advanced treatment faster than German forces could move supplies from depot to frontline. Captain Robert Sherman's medical facilities treated combat injuries, disease, and exhaustion with effectiveness that maintained unit strength at levels German forces could not sustain. His pharmaceutical supplies included medications that German military medicine considered experimental. His surgical equipment enabled procedures that German field hospitals lacked capability to perform. His evacuation system moved patients through treatment stages that German medical doctrine considered impossible under combat conditions. The medical advantage translated into combat effectiveness that multiplied force strength beyond numerical calculations. American units maintained personnel levels that German units could not match due to medical casualties that became permanent losses. Disease rates remained minimal despite field conditions that historically caused massive medical evacuations. Combat injuries that would have disabled German soldiers permanently were treated successfully enough to return personnel to duty. German medical officers captured during the retreat provided intelligence that revealed the scope of American medical superiority. Their testimonies described pharmaceutical shortages that prevented treatment of routine injuries, equipment limitations that made surgical procedures impossible, evacuation systems that could not move casualties fast enough to prevent unnecessary deaths. The medical constraints were reducing German combat effectiveness through attrition that medical treatment could have prevented. The psychological warfare aspect of Red Bull operations extended beyond material demonstration to encompass systematic demoralization of German forces through evidence of unlimited American resources. Every convoy that passed German positions carried visual proof that resistance was futile against enemies possessing infinite supplies. The psychological impact was accumulating into strategic advantage as German morale collapsed under the weight of obvious material inferiority. French civilian populations along convoy routes provided intelligence reports that documented German psychological deterioration. German soldiers observed American supply operations with expressions that French witnesses described as despair rather than tactical interest. German officers questioned French civilians about American industrial capacity with urgency that suggested strategic concern rather than routine intelligence gathering. German units withdrew from positions without engagement when American supply concentrations indicated pending offensive operations. The Red Bull Express had achieved psychological dominance through demonstration rather than propaganda. The sight of endless supply convoys operating with mechanical precision provided evidence that no German propaganda could counter. American abundance was visible, measurable, and undeniable. German scarcity was equally visible, equally measurable, and equally undeniable. The comparison was producing strategic consequences that exceeded the physical impact of supply delivery. By October 1st, 1944, Red Bull Express operations had consumed resources equivalent to the gross domestic product of entire nations while enabling advances that captured territory equivalent to several European countries. The mathematical scope of the operation defied comprehension, even by the personnel who were executing it. Individual drivers had travelled distances exceeding transcontinental journeys. Supply depots had processed tonnage exceeding major seaports. Maintenance facilities had performed repairs exceeding peacetime automotive industries. Yet the system continued expanding, consuming ever greater resources while enabling ever greater advances. The momentum was becoming self-sustaining through the application of unlimited resources to unlimited objectives. The Red Ball Express had transcended emergency logistics to become the foundation for a new kind of warfare, where industrial capacity determined strategic outcomes more decisively than traditional military factors. The trucks continued rolling eastward, carrying with them the tools of inevitable victory and the evidence of American determination to achieve strategic objectives regardless of conventional limitations. The Germans had underestimated American audacity, and that miscalculation was reshaping not just the immediate tactical situation, but the fundamental nature of warfare itself. The transformation was complete by early October, though few recognized it at the time. What had begun as desperate improvisation had evolved into systematic annihilation of German strategic assumptions. The Red Ball Express was no longer delivering supplies to American armies. It was delivering the tools of industrial warfare to forces that had learned to wield abundance as a weapon more devastating than any conventional armament. Oberst Heinrich Weber, the same intelligence officer whose early warnings had been dismissed as fantasy, now found himself preparing reports that his superiors received in stunned silence. His latest assessment, dated October 3, 1944, captured the completeness of German strategic miscalculation with clinical precision. American supply operations now exceed our theoretical maximum capacity by factors that render mathematical comparison meaningless. They waste more resources in routine spillage than we possess for emergency reserves. Their logistical redundancy approaches infinite depth. Weber's reconnaissance teams, operating with increasing duration as DS-Allied air superiority made movement virtually impossible, documented supply concentrations that challenged rational comprehension. American supply depots contained ammunition stockpiles exceeding German annual production. Fuel reserves calculated in quantities that Germany had never possessed simultaneously. Equipment inventories that could outfit armies larger than the entire Wehrmacht at its peak strength. The psychological impact was approaching complete German acceptance of inevitable defeat. Field commanders who had executed brilliant tactical maneuvers throughout the war now submitted situation reports that reflected resignation rather than military analysis. The enemy possesses resources that make resistance futile, wrote General Major Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer Lehr Division. We conserve ammunition while they waste it. We ration fuel while they spill it. We repair equipment while they discard it. American forces were beginning to operate with casual confidence that reflected their material superiority. Units advanced without concern for supply lines, because supply lines extended automatically to support any operation. Artillery preparation phases lasted days rather than hours, because ammunition arrived continuously regardless of consumption rates. Armour operations proceeded without range limitations, because fuel appeared wherever tanks needed refueling. The contrast became most apparent in prisoner interrogations, where German officers described resource management that consumed more energy than combat operations. Every shell had to be justified through paperwork that delayed fire missions until targets disappeared. Every gallon of fuel required authorization that prevented tactical flexibility. Every replacement part demanded procurement procedures that left equipment disabled for weeks. American officers, listening to these accounts, struggled to comprehend military operations constrained by resource limitations that their forces hadn't experienced since the desperate days immediately following Pearl Harbor. The abundance they took for granted represented luxury beyond German imagination. Their routine waste exceeded German emergency allocations. Captain Robert Hayes, commanding a forward supply depot near Verdun, witnessed German reactions to American logistics during prisoner processing. They stared at our supply dumps like they'd discovered buried treasure. Canned food that we fed to prisoners was better than what their officers had eaten in months. Equipment we discarded as worn out was superior to their best maintenance standards. Made you realize we weren't fighting an army anymore, we were fighting the remnants of one. The remnants were becoming increasingly apparent as German units disintegrated under the accumulated stress of chronic shortages. Entire divisions existed primarily on organizational charts, while their actual strength had dwindled to company-sized formations. Equipment REOASDiness rates approached zero, spare parts became unobtainable. Personnel through medical strength decline casualties that proper treatment could have prevented. German to maintain attempts offensive capability required concentrating resources from multiple units to equip single formations for limited operations. The 6th Panzer Army, preparing for what would become the Battle of the Bulge, had to strip equipment from a dozen divisions to achieve minimal operational readiness. Even then, fuel allocations permitted only one major operation before logistical exhaustion would force withdrawal. The mathematical impossibility of German strategic planning was becoming evident to junior officers who lacked the political necessity of maintaining optimistic assessments. Hauptmann Klaus Fischer, operations officer for the 2nd Panzer Division, submitted reports that documented the reality behind official strength figures. On paper, we command 147 tanks. In reality, we possess 31 operational vehicles, 19 requiring major repairs we cannot complete, 27 lacking spare parts that don't exist, and 70 destroyed possibilitied beyond any's hon of recovery. Fischer Resti reflected growing German recognition that the war had become a contest between abundance and scarcity, with the outcome predetermined by industrial capacity rather than military skill. German tactical excellence could no longer compensate for material inferiority that exceeded any historical precedent. The Wehrmacht was fighting with resources that would have been considered inadequate during peacetime training exercises. American supply operations, meanwhile, were achieving efficiency levels that exceeded commercial logistics during optimal conditions. Red Ball Express convoys maintained delivery schedules that civilian trucking companies would have considered impossible under peacetime circumstances. Loading and unloading procedures reduced turnaround times to intervals that maximized road utilization while minimizing delay accumulation. Technical innovations develop operational necessity through revolutionizing logistics doctrine in ways that would influence post-war transportation systems. Convoy coordination procedures enabled traffic management across hundreds of simultaneous routes. Maintenance scheduling prevented breakdown accumulation through predictive replacement of components before failure occurred. Fuel distribution systems eliminated bottlenecks through redundant delivery capabilities. The human cost remained substantial despite technological solutions. Drivers were approaching physical limits that medical intervention could delay but not eliminate indefinitely. Accident rates increased as cumulative fatigue overcame safety procedures. Mechanical precision was being maintained by personnel operating at the edge of human endurance through willpower and stimulant medications. Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson, completing his 41st consecutive day of convoy operations, represented thousands of drivers whose sacrifice enabled strategic transformation. His hands required constant medical attention for nerve damage caused by prolonged vibration exposure. His vision needed corrective lenses to compensate for eye strain from night driving under blackout conditions. His digestive system had adapted to subsisting on rations consumed while driving, creating nutritional deficiencies that vitamins could supplement but not eliminate. Johnson's dedication exemplified the supporting human foundation technological. The achievement Red Ball Express succeeded because individual soldiers exceeded normal human limitations when strategic necessity demanded impossible performance. Their sacrifice enabled military operations that redefined what armies could accomplish when supported by unlimited resources and unlimited determination. The Red Ball Express had achieved something unprecedented in military history. It transformed logistical desperation into strategic dominance through the application of American industrial might and audacious innovation. What began as an emergency trucking operation evolved into the foundation of modern mechanized warfare, proving that abundance could be weaponized as effectively as any conventional armament. The Germans had calculated victory through mathematical certainty, confident that distance and physics would accomplish what their armies could not. They discovered instead that American audacity, backed by unlimited resources and fearless execution, could overcome any obstacle that conventional thinking considered insurmountable. The trucks had stopped rolling, but their legacy thundered across history itself.